Betsy Rosenberg, and I know I say this every time, but I am so excited about the interview I'm about to do. That's why I love doing this, meeting the solutionaries, as we're calling this segment. Lucky me, right? I got an education in my decade plus years of interviewing experts in their field. And I not only got a lot of information on a lot of green topics, but a lot of inspiration. But this one is truly going to be special because what Devi Lockwood did is most impressive and very, very special and oh so timely. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to a woman that pitched me on the book before it even came out. And I was so excited to interview her, except I wasn't in production at that time. That is truly one of the reasons I decided to do Green TV, because it physically, viscerally pains me to not be able to talk to people like Devi Lockwood, who, as you're going to hear, was a student or had just graduated from Harvard with degrees in folklore and mythology, maybe wondering what she was going to do with that when she got an opportunity. I guess it was maybe a gap year, but this is no ordinary gap year, because as you'll hear, the production that is the result of these 5 years is a book, and it just came out. I love to get things hot off the press. It's called 1001 Voices on Climate Change, Everyday Stories of Flood, Fire, Drought, and Displacement from Around the World. And Devi, welcome to Green TV, and tell us about how you managed to interview over 1,000 people. You can say, I guess that's why you got the one in there, and visited 20 countries, some 5 continents, and some of it on bike. I mean, who can see that subtitle and not want to hear more? Welcome to Green TV. So we're so pleased to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's a total honor to be here in conversation with you. Long admired your interviews, and stoked to be chatting with you about this book, which just came out in August. So yeah, there's so many different ways to tell the origin story of how this happened, but one of them is that during the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013, I was living in the Boston area and as a student at that time. And we were on lockdown for several days, which it seems trite now, but at the time it felt significant. Yeah. And the first thing I wanted to do when it was possible to go back outside again was to talk to people and to have conversations with strangers and to remind myself that not everyone was murderous. And I was living in a cooperative house at the time, and we ordered our food in bulk in big cardboard boxes. And so I went under the kitchen sink and got a big broccoli box and cut it open and wrote "open call for stories" on that sign, and tied it around my neck with a piece of ribbon and walked outside with a bunch of balloons because I thought I needed to draw attention to myself. And the premise was just to have a conversation with anyone who wanted to talk to me. And suddenly the world became really alive with storytelling in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I was intrigued and I wanted to do it more. I met everyone from a man who worked for the T, public transportation in the Boston area, who told me about the last time he had a cup of coffee with his mom, to a woman who was advertising parking on a sandwich board downtown, who had just come from Haiti after one of the earthquakes there and talked about the displacement that she feels being far away from her family members. And I got really excited and I wanted to do more of this type of listening. And that summer, I did a bike trip about 800 miles down the Mississippi River, starting in Memphis, Tennessee, and ending in Venice, Louisiana, where the river meets the Gulf of Mexico. And along the way, I brought this cardboard sign. And so when I wasn't on my bicycle, I listened to the stories that people had to share with me, and really found that the farther down the river I rode my bicycle, the more stories I was hearing about water and climate change, in terms of intensified storms and people making a decision to leave a place that they had called home for generations in the aftermath of these storms, and saltwater encroachment on the land, and all sorts of intersecting issues that felt really complicated and important. And I think it's fair to say that climate change is one of the defining issues of my generation. And I wondered what it might mean to put those stories in dialogue with stories from other parts of the world. So I applied for a bunch of grants and got a bunch of no's and one yes, which is all I needed to get started. And that was supposed to support me for a year of purposeful wandering after graduation. And then I just kind of kept on going because getting to somewhere was the main expense. And then once I was there, traveling by bicycle is really cheap. And honestly, so many people were eager to help me out all around the world, which was just such a huge gift. And yeah, I traveled with a cardboard sign. And the one change I made was to make it a bit more direct, because open call for stories was a little bit vague. People would ask me sometimes if I was selling telephones, and I realized that I could say, tell me a story about water on one side and tell me a story about climate change on the other. And I would wear that sign whenever I was not on the bicycle.
Well, it must have been covered in plastic if you must have gotten water when it rained, water on you to wash out the cardboard. Is it really one sign across the world?
Yeah, I didn't wear it when it was raining out, I have to say. So it was, and there were a couple times where the sign would just get really worn out, and then I would make another one. But the great thing about cardboard is that it's a material that's very ubiquitous. It's available anywhere.
Yeah, much everywhere, especially since Amazon came along. So it's hard to know where to begin in terms of your journey, which country, which issue, the people you met. I do want to hear some specific stories that stand out in your mind, but one of the reasons that I am so eager to talk to you and so honored to interview you is because, the news networks primarily that I've been watching and trying to get a show on, Solutions, for the longest time, we're covering the extreme weather because it's so, dramatic when the guy's standing there in the middle of the hurricane and going sideways, the rain, the wind. And we had Snowmageddon in February, this unprecedented freeze in Texas, but mostly people think of the wildfires, the droughts, all the extreme weather that we've had. And it's really only in the last year or two where you started to see what should have happened years ago, the dots connected. But what happens when those crews leave those areas? Look at Ida and people in Louisiana who have been hit repeatedly with mega storms, monster storms, 1 in 500-year storms, along the coast there, Lake Charles. Their lives were devastated. It looks like bombs hit, whether it's a hurricane in the Bahamas a couple of years ago, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, people are still out of their homes. What happens to those people afterwards? And I've always thought it'd be so interesting to go back and interview them and ask them if they understood back then what was causing it. What do they understand now? Did it change their view of the world? Did it change their politics? Did it change their values? So that's what I want to hear. You've done what I don't think anyone else has done.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. And the truth of it is that there's so many different ways of discussing these issues, but oftentimes, I mean, you point to extreme weather events, right? And there can be a lot of attention, especially recently, which is great, where it's possible for people to feel more confident in saying that there is a correlation between climate, or that climate is intensifying these events, right? What I was trying to do in this book is really diversify the way that we talk about expertise. I found that often, especially earlier on in the journey, because I started doing this in 2013, 2014, people were really hesitant to talk about climate change unless they were a climate scientist or someone who was at a climate march, which is a very small segment of the population, right?
Too small. Yes, unfortunately,
yeah.
too small.
Yeah. But I think that it's more possible now. People are becoming, better educated or more aware of the issues, or with these increasing and intensifying events, that it's more possible to just, it's hard not to know someone who's been impacted by it directly, right?
Whether they know it or not.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things I was trying to do is diversify the way that we think about expertise too, because it's super important, of course, to have climate science explained in a way that's clear, that's understandable to someone who's a non-expert. And that becomes a fun, creative challenge of language, right? To break down some of the complexity of things like thermohaline circulation or Antarctic ice core science, right? And one thing I really enjoyed doing this book was connecting with climate scientists across the world who are doing this kind of field work and getting them to describe it in ways that anyone can understand, right? But I think another thing that's important, and as important as taking that science a little bit out of the jargon of its discipline, is also putting it in dialogue with the voices of people who are the most impacted. And there's one kind of group of stories that I think really encapsulate the main issues of the book, and it's the first chapter, which is why I put it there. But Tuvalu is a coral atoll nation that is in the South Pacific, about 580 miles south of the equator. And the highest point on the islands in that country is only about 13 feet above sea level. So it's super low lying. And it's a place that's very vulnerable to small changes in sea level and other impacts of climate change. And I was there for about a month at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015. One of the first things I did when I got there was connect with a man named Tuala Katea, and he at the time was working as the chief meteorological officer. And he told me that in the early 2000s, Tuvaluans living in the outer islands started to notice that their taro and pulaka crops were beginning to rot. And taro and pulaka are starchy staples of Tuvaluan cuisine. They're grown right underground. And what happened, and after they did a period of investigation, they found that there was saltwater intruding in the land due to sea level rise that was making it impossible to grow these crops. And then what happened after that was that the freshwater lens under the island, so freshwater being less dense than the salty, it floats on top. And it used to be that for generations, Tuvaluans were able to dig a relatively shallow well and have water for everything that you need water for: drinking, bathing, cooking, etc. And that water in the early 2000s became both salty and contaminated. So what you see when you go to Tuvalu now is that each home has a tin roof. The roofs used to be thatched, but they're tin now. And they are connected by a pipe to a massive rainwater collection tank. And rains relatively infrequently, but when it does rain, people will leap out of their homes to make sure that that pipe is adequately attached to the rainwater collection tank, because when there's not enough water, things get pretty stressful pretty quickly. There is a desalination plant on the island, but it's very expensive to run, and the water is carefully rationed. So each home will get one kind of 5-gallon size bucket in the morning, one at night, but that's not enough, especially when homes are, large extended family members, everyone's sleeping on the floor kind of thing. And I met one woman named Angelina, who I'm still in touch with. She's fantastic. She's a Tuvalu in my age, and she has a couple of kids. And she told me that the last drought had come a couple years before I was there. And at that time, her daughter was a newborn. And she said that it's so difficult as the woman of the household to have the responsibility of deciding how to allocate that water that came from the desalination plant, right? Yeah. So it was several weeks, if not longer, of a drought that they had where there's just no rain. And she, Angelina, and her older kids and her husband could go bathe themselves in the lagoon. But for her newborn daughter, it would give her a terrible rash if they tried to wash her in that salt water. But she told me, how can I make the decision between having enough water to drink and to cook rice with and having water to wash my newborn baby, right? And that's not a situation that anyone should have to be in, but it's just one example of many of how you can see that climate change in this island nation of 10,000 people is impacting both food and water security. And then the longer term impacts of that are, of course, have to do with migration, right? So many Tuvaluans who are younger, who I spoke with, have made the decision to, look at what's happening to their country, and they don't see their future there. They see it as kind of unpredictable and too tenuous. And so there's a relationship that Tuvalu has set up with the government of New Zealand, and I believe also with Fiji. It's called a Pacific Access Category Visa. And so it's like a visa lottery that people can enter each year. I believe it's been on hold because of the pandemic. But people get a certain amount of documentation together, and then they and their immediate relatives can travel and live in New Zealand. Many Tuvaluans choose to live in Auckland. There's a large expat community there. And before I had gone to Tuvalu, I had heard the idea of climate refugees tossed around, and no one in Tuvalu uses that word themselves. They're very adamant about it being migration and being a choice. And people of the older generation, I would say, by and large, view these changes and climate change as an act of God. They want to stay put because the bones of their ancestors are buried in the front yard, and they cannot imagine leaving that behind. And so it's a very difficult decision, of course, to make. And it brings up big questions about, what it means for a country to potentially become uninhabitable within my lifetime, but then also what it means for cultural survival, whether or not that's, possible, or what will change when so many Tuvaluans are living out of their own country. And so
rain drain. You're losing your smartest, best, students and future engineers, among others.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's so important to, consider like, yes, this is only a nation of 10,000 people, but their voices really matter. And it's so important to carefully study what's happening, because it's a pattern that is repeating in so many other places in other parts of the world. I mean, I think about a couple of years later, I was in Thailand, in Bangkok, and I met a modern dancer named Soon, who was descendant from a family that had been rice farming for generations in the rural north. And he told me that as the rainfall patterns are changing, rice farming is becoming a less stable, less viable future. And so he had decided, like many other young Thai people, to come to the city in search of work. And it's a pattern that we see repeated over and over again, in terms of, if you change where the rain falls, you change where people are able to grow food, and then everything becomes more unstable.
Yeah, and I don't know if you went to, but certainly I'm sure you heard about what happened with the people on the Marshall Islands, how they got migrated to Oklahoma, I think. Talk about culture shock. So this is happening, not just on the low-lying smaller nations, but around the world. I believe you also spent some time in Mexico, just to shift geographically a little bit. Was that right? I heard you tell some stories at Climate Week, and I believe that was where you spent some time. There's a few standout stories, but there's so many great ones. You can imagine 1,001 voices.
Yeah. I've been to Mexico, but not to record stories for this book. But I was in Peru for about a month, and there's a really fascinating project happening along the Amazon River, where a group of indigenous people in a town called Payan are making a living library of medicinal plants. And so the effort to catalog these plants is kind of inspired by many things, but first and foremost, in order to limit deforestation in the area, which contributes negatively to climate change in the longer term. They're trying to cultivate kind of a renewal of the valuing of these plants and their purposes, not only for youth in the community who are perhaps a bit more distanced from that form of understanding just because of the reality of what their education is like, but also for tourists who come in looking for an ecotourism experience. And yeah, it was really interesting spending time with the folks who are working on that project, because it's gets at the heart of what it might mean to try to create a climate solution at a hyper local level.
And where did the bike fit in? Because I don't know if you plan to be on bike for much of a 5-year trek across the world, but that's impressive, especially some years ago.
Yeah. So I was on the bicycle about half of the time, so around 2.5 years. And it was incredible. I love traveling by bicycle. I think it is an incredible way to see a place slowly. What I also love about the bicycle is that it gets me to the places between places. If I'm using other forms of transportation, I tend to end up at an urban hub of some kind, or the place where the transportation takes you, right? But the great thing about being on a bike is you spend so much time in rural areas and in places where other people might not think to stop. And I just found it to be such a social way of traveling, and traveling solo as well, because people were curious about what I was doing and why I was doing it. And it was so intense and wonderful, listening deeply to people's stories. But then I would have this counterpoint to each day where I would be on my own on the bike, thinking, moving. And that for me was kind of an essential part of my writing process, but also frankly was just a lot of fun to be able to move and experience the landscape in that really hyper embodied way.
And what did you do for meals? And did you have an advanced team, or did you stop and spend time before you went to each destination to set up interviews and lodging and all that, like the logistics of it? And as a woman traveling alone, did you ever feel endangered in any way?
So the logistics were pretty chaotic. I would say I had a general direction and then figured out a lot of things on the way by improvising. I was raised by mountain climbers, so sleeping outside is no big deal to me. I had a tent with me. I would ask people permission to pitch it, or sometimes they would just invite me inside. And there's a really incredible website called Warm Showers, which is like couch surfing, but it's for people who ride their bikes. And
we need showers.
Yeah. And so I was hosted so many times around the world by people on Warm Showers who are cyclists themselves, or just love having cyclists telling stories in their homes. And that was really Lovely. And sometimes, honestly, I think being a solo woman traveling, people don't presume me as threatening. I'm not that tall. I'm white. I'm young. And so people were very eager to take me in. And sometimes people would, call their friends up the next town over or annotate my map with their friends' names who I could stay with. And that was just, such a huge act of kindness that I think frankly kept me alive. I don't think I would have been able to keep going for as long as I did without all of those forms of support, and so grateful for it. Something I hope to pay it forward in the future in some way. And in terms of negative experiences, I mean, on the bike, really can't think of any. It was such a fantastic way of moving around, and it's a form of transport I would be using even if I wasn't traveling. So it didn't seem any more or less risky to me. I did have one kind of negative experience that I get into more in depth in the book, so I'll save it for right now.
Yeah,
But it was specifically on a bus going between Laos and Cambodia, and wasn't even with a person who was from one of those countries. It was with an American man who was like targeting me directly. So that, I mean, I think being a woman, being alive in the world is inherently dangerous. And I would say for anyone out there who's listening and thinking about doing a trip, whether by bicycle or not, traveling solo is such an amazing way to see the world. It's so social. I meet way more people when I'm traveling on my own than I do if I'm traveling with other folks. And I think it's just a really beautiful way to see a place and immerse yourself.
And was there a set itinerary years before, or was it really a very intentional, well-informed, but somewhat spontaneous meander with a purpose? Like, and how did you know when you had enough material for one place and, move on? Like, that to me would be, these are kind of maybe silly questions, but just as I try to imagine doing what you've done, no small accomplishment, like the nuts and bolts of it, as well as obviously the huge informing and impactful stories that you told.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of the latter, more a little bit just figuring it out on the go. But so the kind of the first point on my map was Tuvalu, and I was dating someone at the time who was taking a politics of immigration course and tossed this article across the table at me saying, "Hey, Devi, you might be interested in this." And it was about Tuvalu and the migration to other countries in the region. And so I knew that I wanted to go there. And then kind of, pulling back on the map a little bit, zooming out, Fiji is right nearby. And so I thought, when else in my life am I going to have time to travel in Fiji? I would love to. And then New Zealand was also nearby there. And I had heard it was a great place to ride bikes and wanted to get started on the bike part of the journey there. My idea at that point was that I would fly from New Zealand to the UK because I was too nervous to do the storytelling project at first anywhere where English wasn't the main spoken language. Didn't want to go to Australia because I grew up watching Steve Irwin and I was convinced that I would die from any number of poisonous animals. And and that was my plan. And what happened was really interesting, actually. I kind of had to let go of that plan a little bit. When I was riding my bike in New Zealand, I felt within myself this like deep urge to slow down. And I realized that I'd been living a lot of my life up to that point kind of with speed and with efficiency in mind, and that I wanted to see what would happen if I let some of that go. And then the other thing that happened, which was really interesting, is I met some climate activists in Wellington, New Zealand, who urged me to look at the environmental footprint of all the flying that I had done to date. So I went on to
come up, right? Everybody. So ecologically, well, not everybody, not nearly enough people, but that comes up when you're a climate journalist and you go to conferences around the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I went online to an environmental footprint calculator and put in all the flying that I was doing. And sure enough, that was disproportionately impactful in a negative way in terms of my carbon footprint compared to anything else that I could have done. And so I was like, all right, let me see what happens if I try not to fly and I gave myself a year, which was ended up being an interesting creative challenge. So I crowdfunded the money because I was in New Zealand at this point to take a cargo ship from New Zealand to Australia. Spent about 6 months riding up the east coast of Australia on my bike, and then started to hitch a ride on a sailboat that was going to go to Indonesia. And I got pretty seasick, and the crew decided that it was probably not the best idea to continue having me aboard that boat. So then they left me on an island. It sounds more dramatic than it was. It was fine. And I jumped ship going on another sailboat going south and ended up on another cargo ship back in New Zealand. And part of the problem was that you can sort of neatly divide the earth into like the land hemisphere on one side and the water hemisphere on the other. And New Zealand is right in the middle of the water hemisphere. And so it was a little bit challenging. I gave myself another couple months back in New Zealand to try to figure out a way to get anywhere else that wasn't Australia, and it ended up not working out. So I bought a cheap flight to Bangkok at that point. And then from there on, it was in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Then I had been on the road for about 2.5 years at that point, really needed to come home, and I did. And then I did a bunch of out and back journeys that were not on the bike, but let me get to places that were farther off the beaten path, like the Canadian Arctic, and also north of the Arctic Circle in Sweden and Norway. And it was in China a handful of times. It was just super interesting, so I had to surrender a bit to the zigzag flow of it.
I was just I wonder what happened to that boyfriend. Did he wait?
Oh, no, it's fine. It was just figuring things out as it went. Yeah.
So interesting. We just have a few more minutes. What does one do after this kind of adventure? My goodness, what's next? Besides the book and doing a lot of promotion, I hope, for it, because
yeah. So I sort of fell sideways into a career in journalism from all of this. I started freelance writing, and then I had a few agents who reached out to me and said, "Hey, it sounds like you have enough material for a book." And I was like, "Oh." You asked earlier also about how I knew when I had enough stories from a place, and I don't know, honestly, it was just limited by how long my visa was in each spot. But I found that in general, like if I spent more than a month somewhere, especially if it was a smaller community, then I sort of had a handle on the topic. And beyond that, I came back and realized that the divide I spoke to earlier about how, there's climate scientists working on the issue on one hand, and then the general public and what they understand on the other. And there's often a very large gap between those two. And so I wanted to use the techniques of writing and metaphor and things like that I had developed to help bridge that gap. And so I did a master's program in science journalism at MIT, and then was very fortunate to sign this book contract and also do a year-long fellowship at the New York Times, the opinion section. So I did that. And right now my day job is I work for a startup nonprofit newsroom called Rest of World, and we cover the impacts of technology outside of the West. So it's been fun to kind of lean in on some of the more international journalism skills that I developed, but in a completely different way, looking at tech and tech markets. And and then at night I wrote this book during the pandemic year. So it was kind of going through all those audio interviews and past research and writing and creating it together into this one coherent piece. And it's been really wonderful to share it with people. I've been really moved by some of the responses to the book so far. So it's been great.
Surprised. It's so intriguing and it's so timely. And are you tempted to, do you wish you had a video camera with you when you went to turn this into a documentary, or is the written word and I guess the audio interviews enough? And I'm sure they are, but that's what people always think. Well, I wish I could kind of watch this. So is there that in the future, or are you going to stick to it? And then, by the way, I should say a lot of your articles and opinion pieces have been printed a lot of places, New York Times, Wired, and others as well. So the world is discovering you, which is a wonderful thing. And yeah, what any new travel plans or anything that big, or are you just happy to have seen the world and talked to people across the world on the most important issue of not only our lifetimes, but perhaps humanity?
Yeah, I mean, so if it weren't for the pandemic, I would have been spending about a month in Antarctica in 2020. And so I would love to try to make that happen. Again, this was through the National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers program. So if and when they get that program jump started again, I would love to interview some of the scientists who are doing research in one of what I think is the most interesting environments in the world.
And you will have that on every content, I think there.
Yeah, that would be the last one.
and you saved the best for last, given that they're the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, in terms of things.
It's I think it's important to amplify the kind of research that they're doing there. And beyond that, I mean, if the opportunity presents itself to travel and report more, I would absolutely love to. It's always such a joy to do that, and something that I hope to be able to do more of moving forward.
And what a privilege, especially at such a young age. Good for you. And one last question, just curious, did you send a copy of the book, or will you, to all the 1,001 people you interview? Because I would imagine they would find reading that, especially in the context of the whole world, pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's in progress, working on it.
Okay, good. Well, I want to get a copy and read it. I read excerpts and it's just fabulous. And we just had, prior to you, a producer who did a film called Normal is Over, and she did kind of the documentary equivalent. She traveled the world with her daughter and looked for solutions to
Wow, that's incredible.
challenges. Yeah,
I love
I want
that.
to connect you two. You should meet.
Yeah, that would be
Who knows
great. I
what's
mean,
gonna
and
do
you asked
together.
about cameras as well. And I think for me, I didn't really want there to be a lens between or kind of an object between myself and the person I was speaking with. I found it to be a little bit more intimate to rely on audio. And also, frankly, just because it was me doing this and I only have two hands, it was a little bit more friendly in terms of the setup. But I'm very open to those kinds of collaborations in the future. I think that video is such an important part of climate and science communication in general.
And I would imagine that people you're going to stay in touch with over the years.
Yeah,
because,
definitely.
I mean, this is it's a moment in time, but it's a very broad and, pretty deep moment in time that you captured. So so interesting. And so glad you did it. I'm sure you are too. I mean,
Thanks.
really, what an education, first.
Yeah. I mean, my hope is that it can be just a little archive for the future, a snapshot about how we were thinking and talking about climate change in this kind of crucial period.
Yeah, well, congratulations. And I
Thank you.
applaud you for the scope of it, but just the logistics. Like, I know just when I've been on fires as a reporter, something relatively small and contained, where you talk to one neighbor and they say, oh, you got to talk to so-and-so. And then they say, oh, you got to talk to so-and-so. And before I know it, it's like, oh my gosh, so many people. And you did on a much larger scale with the urgency around the issues you were discussing. I have a lot of respect for that, because like, sort of like, how do you know when to stop when you've got
Right.
that kind of thing?
Right. Yeah, I guess it's just the feeling ready to do it, right? Jumping in.
Well,
Yeah.
good for you, Debbie. Thanks so much for your contribution to this important conversation that we're starting to have more often and hopefully more loudly, not just in this country, but around the world. I guess, okay, I have to wrap up, but just last thoughts about, are you optimistic that we're going to turn this ship around in time? And you don't have to say yes. What are your thoughts here? I try to go for the truth because that's more interesting than anything else.
I would say I have the most hope and kind of active hope in the folks who are perhaps not in leadership positions internationally, but who are working and focusing on solutions in very targeted ways in their communities. And that is, for me, an antidote to despair, is listening to those voices and amplifying them. So I remain convinced that hope is an active verb, but it's something that we all have to choose to do in a daily way. And yeah, it's important thing to maintain.
Absolutely. And if one way to get those voices out there is exactly what you've done, because I know I've seen so many people, activists, professionals in the environmental world, pulling their hair out. How can we reach the masses? How can we educate people? And I raise my hand and say mainstream media, and especially because right-wing media is giving the disinformation piece of this, and media is critically important. And I have written a lot and spoken a lot and stressed out a lot about the fact that my broadcast news industry has not done a very good job at all, barely at all, till recently, in connecting the dots and showing, with the amount of content that they provide and just the import of it, the sort of the ratio, has really been out of whack with some other stories that are not nearly as impactful and important. So clearly we have to go around mainstream media, and you've certainly found a way to, you found a path to do that. So thank you. And we just need more of you, and more loudly and more frequently. So I'm not sure you need to do it again, but hopefully you've inspired others to think of ways how in their life they can, as a journalist or a scientist or just a citizen, take a really important gap year. I mean, if you want to figure out what's going on in the world, that's a good time of life to do it, but it doesn't have to be at any age. This is worth exploring. So thank you for what you've done. Really appreciate talking to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun, and here's to storytelling.
Absolutely. Good luck with the book. I'll spread the word where I can, and hope it does very well. Really important work. And that does it for this edition of Green TV. See, I promise you the most interesting, innovative leaders in some aspect of our imperiled planet and what they're doing about it, because yeah, talking is important, because we do have to understand what we're up against. Otherwise we can't solve the problems, but doing and talking are a really powerful combination, especially in this instance. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. See you next time.